In a quiet neighborhood, a life-changing moment unfolded that no one could have predicted. It was a hot afternoon, and the sun beat down on the street as people went about their usual routines. But everything changed in an instant. A small child, only a few months old, was playing outside her family's home when something went terribly wrong. A simple moment of carelessness, or maybe just an unforeseen accident, led to a tragedy waiting to happen. But then, in a flash, a stranger appeared out of nowhere, rushing towards the baby. Without hesitation, he grabbed the child just in time, pulling her from danger. Now, you might think the story would end there, an unexpected hero, a life saved, but it doesn't. Because what happened next will leave you questioning everything you know about humanity. The person who saved the baby wasn't someone you'd expect, and the family of the child had a response that no one saw coming. It wasn't just about the life saved, it was about the emotions, the connections, and the powerful reminder of how kindness can break down walls we never thought could be crossed. Imagine the scene: a man, from a different background, with no ties to the family, risking everything for someone he didn't even know. His actions, though selfless, would be met with something more than just gratitude. It would spark conversations, challenge perceptions, and reveal the deep truths we sometimes try to avoid. When you think of a heroic act, you might picture a firefighter or a police officer, but in this story, it was an ordinary person, someone just like you or me, who stepped up when no one else did. And what's even more astonishing is how the family responded. How did the family react when they found out who their child's savior was? What did they say to the man who risked his life for their precious one? Were they just thankful, or did something more profound take place? The answers will not only surprise you, they will open your eyes to the power of humanity. And as you start to piece together what happened, you might begin to wonder if we all can be heroes, no matter where we come from or what we look like. But the most amazing part of this story is yet to come. The aftermath of this life-saving event would lead to a series of events that no one could have anticipated. It challenged old views, sparked deep reflection, and most importantly, it reminded us all of one undeniable truth: in times of crisis, it's not about the color of your skin or where you come from, it's about who you are when someone needs help. And as we dig deeper into this remarkable story, you'll start to understand why the family's response is something you won't forget. So stay with me, because this story is just getting started. You won't believe what happens next. The scene was still fresh in everyone's minds. That afternoon had felt like any other, but it became a defining moment for the family and the community. For the parents of the child, it was a quiet street, a peaceful day, and in the blink of an eye, their whole world had changed. They'd never imagined that an ordinary walk to the park would end with their daughter in danger. How could they have known that a split-second decision, a simple glance away, could lead to such chaos? The baby, just starting to sit up and explore the world around her, was doing what any curious child would. She was reaching for the grass, trying to understand what this strange green thing was beneath her tiny hands. Her parents, sitting nearby on the porch, were caught up in a conversation, oblivious to the world shifting just a few feet away. The child, so innocent and carefree, had no idea what was happening. Then it happened. The family dog, usually friendly and protective, had gotten spooked by something, a passing car, perhaps. It darted across the yard, pulling at the leash in a desperate, uncontrolled frenzy. In its panic, the dog knocked over the stroller where the baby had been sitting, sending it rolling toward the edge of the sidewalk. As the stroller tipped, the child's head came dangerously close to the curb. The parents froze in terror. It all seemed to move in slow motion. One moment, the baby was in danger, and the next, there was a stranger, a man no one had seen before, sprinting across the yard, scooping up the child in a swift motion. He hadn't hesitated. There was no second thought. He just acted. The baby was safe, clutched firmly in his arms, and the man was standing there, breathing hard, looking down at the tiny life he had just saved. The parents rushed forward in a panic, their voices shaking as they demanded to know what happened. They were disoriented, still processing the events that had unfolded so quickly. But they knew one thing for sure: their child was alive, and it was thanks to this stranger. This wasn't just a random rescue. It wasn't a heroic moment on the side of a busy street where people rushed to help. It was personal. The man who had saved their daughter wasn't just some passerby. He wasn't a firefighter or a paramedic. He was someone who had been walking down the street, minding his own business, when he saw the danger. And yet, without a thought for his own safety, he had leaped into action. But who was he? Where had he come from? Why was he even there at that exact moment? The parents couldn't help but wonder. They had seen him in the neighborhood before, but they didn't know him by name. He was just someone who lived a few blocks away, perhaps. Maybe they had seen him walking his dog, or driving through the streets. He seemed familiar enough, but there was something about him they couldn't quite place. As the man stood there, holding their child, the parents were overcome with emotion. Their hearts were racing, still unsure whether what had just happened was real. The man hadn't said much. He had simply asked if the child was okay, his face a mixture of concern and uncertainty. There was no dramatic speech, no moment of glory for the stranger. It was as if he had done what anyone would do in that moment, without expecting anything in return. The mother was the first to speak. She was overwhelmed with gratitude, her voice trembling as she thanked him. But there was something else in her eyes, something deeper than just appreciation. It was confusion, mixed with an unspoken question. Why him? Why had he been the one to rush in when so many others could have been nearby? Her mind raced with unanswered questions, but she didn't dare ask them. Not yet. There was no time to dwell on that now. The baby was safe, and that was all that mattered. The father, on the other hand, stood there in silence. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, there was a profound relief that their daughter was unharmed. On the other hand, there was something unsettling about the situation. Something about the way the man had appeared from nowhere, almost as if he had been waiting for the exact moment to act. It wasn't just coincidence, and it wasn't just heroism, it was something more. The father's instincts were telling him that there was more to this story than met the eye. And yet, there was no denying that the stranger had saved their child. No one else had been there in that moment. No one else had reacted as quickly, or as selflessly. It was an act of pure courage, and for that, the parents would be forever grateful. But that didn't stop the questions from swirling in their minds. As the moments passed, the man carefully handed the baby back to her mother, who hugged her tightly, her eyes filled with tears. The father, still uncertain, stepped forward, offering a handshake. The man hesitated for a moment before accepting it, a silent acknowledgement of the gratitude between them. There was no need for words, not in that moment. Everything had been said in the way they had looked at each other, the shared understanding that something extraordinary had just occurred. But as the man began to walk away, something about his departure didn't sit right with the father. It wasn't just the way he had come and gone so quickly, or the fact that he had saved their daughter with such ease. It was the way he had looked at them. The way his eyes seemed to hold a secret, something unspoken, something that couldn't be shared in just a few moments. Later that evening, as the family sat in their living room, still reeling from the events of the day, they couldn't stop talking about the man who had saved their child. The mother kept replaying the scene in her mind, trying to piece together every detail. She had seen him from the corner of her eye as he approached, his face set in determination. But there was something else, something intangible, that made her wonder if this encounter had been more than just chance. Her thoughts drifted to the idea of fate, how everything had aligned perfectly for the man to be there at that precise moment. Had he known the baby would be in danger? Had he seen something they hadn't? The questions seemed endless, but there were no answers. It was as if the man had appeared out of thin air, swooping in like an angel when they needed him the most. But was he an angel, or just a person who happened to be in the right place at the right time? As night fell and the family settled into a quiet routine, the father couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. He didn't know why, but he felt certain that the stranger's appearance wasn't random. There was something more to him, something hidden beneath the surface. And he was determined to find out what it was. Tomorrow, he decided, he would start asking questions. He would speak to the neighbors, see if anyone knew anything about the man who had saved their daughter. But for now, all he could do was wait. Wait for answers, wait for the truth, and wait for the story to unfold in ways he could never have imagined. The next day, as the family went about their usual routine, the memory of that terrifying moment still hung in the air. But the mystery of the stranger lingered even more. Was he just a passerby, or was there something greater at play? The father's instincts told him that there was more to this story, something deeper than just a simple rescue. And it was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light. But for now, the family could only wonder what was the next chapter in this incredible story. The answers were out there, but they wouldn't be found easily. The stranger had already made his exit, disappearing just as quickly as he had arrived. But the questions he left behind were only beginning to take shape. And soon, the family would find themselves entangled in a story that would change their lives forever. The days that followed were filled with a mix of normalcy and tension. Life had returned to a routine for the family, but there was an undercurrent of unease. The father tried to push the thoughts of the stranger to the back of his mind. His daughter was fine, and that was all that mattered. He didn't want to dwell on things that might have no answers. But his curiosity, his gut feeling that something wasn't right, kept gnawing at him. He began talking to neighbors, asking around casually. He didn't want to raise suspicion or appear too obsessive, but he couldn't help it. Every time he thought about the man, the same questions returned. Why had he been there? How had he reacted so quickly, so instinctively? The stranger's sudden appearance was too precise, too perfect. No one in the neighborhood seemed to know him. Some had seen him before, walking around, but no one could recall his name or any details about his life. It was as if he had come from nowhere, and that unsettled the father in ways he couldn't fully explain. The mother, too, found herself caught up in the mystery. She had tried to put the incident behind her, focusing on caring for her child, but every time she saw the baby, she thought of the man who had saved her. She would replay the scene in her mind, focusing on the way his eyes had met hers. There had been something there, something she couldn't place. It wasn't just gratitude or concern. It was something more, a depth to his presence that felt out of place. She couldn't shake the thought that there was a reason he had been there. It wasn't mere coincidence. But what could that reason be? The couple talked late into the night, sharing their suspicions. The father was more determined than ever to find answers. But the mother, despite her questions, felt a strong sense of guilt. She worried that questioning the man's motives somehow diminished the value of what he had done. Was it wrong to want to know more? Was it enough to simply be thankful for his actions? Her heart tugged at the idea that maybe the story had been enough as it was. But her mind kept pulling her back into the mystery, like a thread she couldn't untangle. The man had left so quickly after the rescue. Almost too quickly. The father's mind kept coming back to that one detail. He hadn't stayed for the usual exchange of pleasantries, or even a simple thank you. No, he had disappeared the moment the baby was safe, as though he had a purpose elsewhere, as though he had no interest in being noticed or celebrated. There was something about that which seemed strange, even unsettling. The father began to wonder, was he simply being paranoid, or was something more at play? Meanwhile, the mother spent hours thinking about the emotional toll the incident had taken on her. She had been so shaken by the moment of crisis that she hadn't thought about what it meant for her as a person. Her reaction, like most people's, had been instinctual, thankful for the rescue, but she had never stopped to ask why she felt a strange, lingering connection to the man. Why did it feel like there was some unspoken bond between them? Why was her heart so restless? As the father continued his search for answers, he reached out to local social media groups, trying to gather any scraps of information. One afternoon, he found a post in an online neighborhood forum from someone who mentioned seeing a man near the park a few weeks before the incident. The post was vague, just a fleeting mention of a stranger with intense eyes who had been in the area, watching people from afar. It was enough to raise the father's suspicion even further. Who was this man? What was his connection to the neighborhood? Could he have been there before, in other places, watching? In the following days, the father started noticing small things, strange coincidences that made him feel like he was being watched. It wasn't obvious at first, just a feeling, but it became more pronounced. He'd walk down the street and see the same man in the distance, his figure blending into the background like part of the scenery. The man never approached, never made any move toward him, but he was there. Watching. The father tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to him, weighing on him with an intensity he couldn't explain. Meanwhile, the mother's feelings of guilt began to shift into something else. She hadn't noticed it before, but she was starting to question her own responses to the man. Why had she been so eager to accept his help? Could it be that, deep down, she was longing for something more, something the stranger represented? She had always been someone who trusted her intuition, but this sense of attachment to the man was unsettling. She didn't know why, but she felt as if she was missing something crucial. There had been a look in his eyes, something that seemed to connect them beyond the surface level of gratitude. It wasn't just about saving her child, it was about something deeper. She didn't know what it was, but the feeling was there, lingering like a shadow. The tension was mounting. The father, still determined to uncover the truth, decided to take a more direct approach. One morning, he visited the local CAF where the man was known to grab coffee occasionally. He asked the barista if they knew anything about the man, but the response was vague. The man was a regular, that was all. No one knew much about his background or where he was from. It felt like everyone was guarding some secret, but no one was saying anything. The more the father dug, the more elusive the man seemed to become. It was as if he existed only as a shadow in the corners of the neighborhood, never fully visible, never fully known. The family's life became increasingly consumed by the mystery. They started talking about the man less, but the unsaid words were always present, hovering just below the surface of their conversations. The mother, especially, couldn't stop thinking about him. She tried to focus on her day, taking care of her daughter, but every time she looked at her child, she couldn't help but wonder who the man was and why he had been there when he was. Had he been looking for something? Had he been waiting for a sign, for a moment to act? Then, as if the universe had decided to answer their questions, the father received an unexpected visit. A knock at the door one evening, and there he was, the man who had saved their child. Standing on their doorstep, not with an announcement or a proud smile, but with an air of quiet urgency. He was dressed differently this time, more formally, his demeanor serious. He asked if he could come inside, and though the father's heart raced with suspicion, he agreed. "I need to talk to you," the man said, his voice low and steady. "It's about your daughter. And it's about what happened that day." The tension that had been building in the father's chest exploded. He stood in the doorway, frozen for a moment, trying to process the implications of the man's words. What was this about? Why had he come back? What did he know? And more importantly, what had brought him here now, when the family had already been left with more questions than answers? As the man stepped inside, the door closed behind him with a soft click, and the father felt a surge of both relief and dread. The answers he had been searching for were finally within reach, but would they come at a cost too high to bear? The man stepped into the living room with an air of purpose, but his presence only intensified the tension that already hung in the air. The father stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to say, what to do. He had spent days obsessing over this stranger, digging for clues, piecing together fragments of information that didn't quite fit. And now, here he was, standing right in front of him, like the answer to a question that had plagued him for days. The father motioned for him to sit, though he barely noticed the movement of his hand. His mind was racing. What was happening? Why was this man here again? Had he come to explain his actions that day? Or was there more to this than a simple act of kindness? His heart pounded as he waited for the man to speak. The stranger didn't sit. Instead, he turned to face the father, his gaze intense and unreadable. For a moment, the room felt suffocating. The man's presence filled the space, and it was as if every second dragged on longer than the last. Finally, the stranger spoke, his voice low and steady. "I'm sorry for showing up like this," he said, glancing around the room as if weighing his words carefully. "I didn't want to do this, but I have no choice." The father's stomach tightened. "What do you mean, no choice?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Why are you here?" The man took a deep breath and then, with a glance toward the mother, who was standing by the kitchen door, uncertain but trying to remain composed, he continued. "Your daughter. She wasn't supposed to be in danger that day," he said, each word dropping like a heavy weight. "That wasn't just a random event. It wasn't a coincidence." The father's mind reeled. Was this man telling him that everything that had happened had been planned? That the danger to his daughter wasn't just an accident? His throat went dry, and his pulse quickened as he struggled to process what he was hearing. "What do you mean? Are you saying you knew something was going to happen?" The father's voice rose, but he quickly caught himself. He didn't want to sound hysterical, but this was too much. His daughter, his precious little girl, had been in danger, and now, this stranger was telling him that it wasn't by chance? That it had been orchestrated? The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the father's. "Yes. But not in the way you think. I didn't cause it. But I was aware that something was coming. I just didn't know it would be her." The room felt colder, the walls closing in. The father's head spun, and he could barely catch his breath. What was this man saying? His daughter had been a target? How could that be? Why would anyone want to harm his child? His instincts screamed at him to push the man away, to end this conversation before it went any further, but something inside him urged him to listen. He needed to understand. He needed to know the truth. The mother, having stood in silence up until now, finally spoke. "Who are you?" Her voice trembled with a mix of fear and anger. "What do you want from us? Why come back now? Why not tell us sooner?" The stranger's eyes softened, but there was still a seriousness to them that made the father's skin crawl. "I'm not your enemy," he said quietly. "I'm here to protect her. And I'm here to make sure that she's safe. But there's more you need to know. More than I can say right now." The father's heart raced. Every word from the man felt like another layer of mystery, like they were stepping deeper into a web that had been spun around them without their knowledge. This wasn't just some random act of heroism. This was something more. More? What do you mean? The father's voice broke, his frustration mounting. "Tell me everything. Right now." The stranger took another deep breath, his gaze flickering to the floor before he looked back up at the father. "I can't explain everything right now," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But what I can tell you is that your daughter is special. She's not just any child." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. Special? What did that mean? The father felt a chill run down his spine. Was this some kind of sick joke? His daughter, his innocent child, was just that innocent. Special? It didn't make sense. The stranger continued, his voice now urgent. There are people, powerful people, who would do anything to control her. To use her. And they know about her now. That's why I'm here. That's why I had to act. I couldn't let them get to her before I could get to you. The father felt his knees go weak. The words were impossible to process. His daughter, someone so pure, so innocent, was being hunted? How? Why? Who were these people? The questions swirled in his mind, but the answer eluded him. I know this is hard to believe, the man said, his tone softer now. But I swear to you, everything I've done, everything I've risked has been for her. And now that you know, you're in danger too. The tension in the room was palpable, and the father's head was spinning. Was this man trying to protect them, or was he leading them down a path they couldn't return from? There were too many unknowns. Too many questions with no clear answers. The man had saved their daughter, but at what cost? What had he gotten himself involved in? And why had he come back now, after all this time? Suddenly, a noise from outside broke the silence, a distant sound, faint but unmistakable. The father's heart skipped a beat. It was the unmistakable sound of a car screeching to a halt. Tires skidding. The unmistakable sound of someone arriving quickly. The man's eyes flicked toward the window, his body tense as if he could sense the danger before it even arrived. His expression hardened, his voice dropping to a whisper. They're here. The father's mind raced. Who was they? And why had the danger followed them here? His body froze. The tension in the room thickened to a breaking point as the weight of the situation crashed down on him. This was no longer just about a random rescue. This was about something far bigger, far darker, than he could have ever imagined. As the father turned toward the window, he saw the faint silhouette of a vehicle pulling up in front of their house. His blood ran cold. Everything had changed. And whatever happened next, their lives would never be the same. The car that had screeched to a halt in front of their house was now idling in the driveway, its engine humming ominously in the quiet night. The stranger's eyes locked onto the window, his face draining of color as the seconds stretched on each one heavier than the last. The father's heart pounded in his chest, a cold sweat forming on his brow. Who was coming? Who were these people? And why was this stranger acting so terrified? Before the father could open his mouth to ask another question, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. He whipped his head around, but it wasn't the stranger who was moving. It was his daughter, the little girl who had been at the center of it all, the one they'd been trying to protect. She appeared at the doorframe, her wide eyes innocent, unaware of the gravity of the situation unfolding around her. The father's first instinct was to run to her, to shield her, to pull her close and protect her from whatever danger lurked outside. But the man's voice stopped him cold. Don't, he hissed, his eyes darting between the girl and the father, panic creeping into his tone. Stay back. She can't see them. The father's heart sank. The fear in the stranger's voice was enough to make his blood run cold. His daughter, this innocent child, was in more danger than he could have ever imagined. But what was happening? What had he gotten himself into? Before he could respond, a sharp knock came from the front door, cutting through the tension like a knife. The father's breath caught in his throat. His pulse raced as he glanced over at the stranger, who was now visibly shaking. The man mouthed a single word, "Run," before turning toward the window. His eyes flicked to the car outside and then back to the father. Without another word, the man bolted for the back door, disappearing into the dark shadows of the house. The father stood frozen, torn between following the man or keeping his family safe. Another knock came, louder this time. His instincts screamed at him to stay, to protect his daughter, but every fiber of his being told him something was horribly wrong. Reluctantly, he turned toward his daughter, the girl now standing still in the doorway, her small hands gripping the frame. Her face was full of confusion, but there was something else there too, something almost knowing. As though she had felt the weight of the danger before it even arrived. "Daddy, who's at the door?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. The father couldn't find the words. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from whatever was coming, but he didn't know how. He didn't know what was happening anymore. Man had warned him. And the stranger's warning echoed in his ears, louder than anything else. "They're here." His eyes flicked back to the window just as the car door opened. A tall figure stepped out, wearing a dark jacket and moving with an air of purpose. The figure's face was obscured, but the walk was unmistakable, steady, calculated. This wasn't just anyone. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The father's mind raced. Was this the group the stranger had warned him about? Who were they? And what did they want with his daughter? His thoughts were interrupted by another knock, this time followed by a voice from the other side of the door. It was smooth, cold, and deliberate, as if every word had been rehearsed. "Open up. We know she's in there. We're not leaving without her." The father's breath caught in his throat. The words felt like a slap in the face, like a physical blow that reverberated through his body. His daughter. They knew about her. The strangers were here for her, just like the man had said. But who were they? And how had they known she was there? A sickening realization hit him all at once. These people weren't just after his daughter. They were after something far more dangerous. They were after power, control, something that had to do with his child and possibly the stranger as well. This wasn't just a random act of violence or an isolated incident. This was bigger. Much bigger. The man's warning echoed in the father's ears once again, louder this time. "She's special. They'll stop at nothing to get to her." What did that mean? Why was his daughter so important? What had she gotten involved in, and why hadn't he known about any of this? The knock came again, this time more urgent. The father's legs felt weak as he moved toward the door, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He reached out, gripping the handle, but his hand faltered. He couldn't open the door. Not to these people. Not without knowing what was at stake. But before he could decide what to do, the door creaked open on its own. The father spun around, panic flooding his chest, only to see his daughter standing there, her small hand resting on the doorframe. Her innocent eyes, wide with curiosity, locked with his. "They're here, Daddy," she whispered, her voice soft and strangely certain. The words sent a chill down his spine. How did she know? How could she have known? He rushed to her side, but before he could pull her away from the door, the figure outside spoke again, this time with an edge of impatience. "We don't want to hurt you," the voice called, now louder, more insistent. "Just open the door. Let's make this easy." Something in the tone of the voice made the father's stomach twist. It wasn't a request anymore. It was a demand. And if he didn't act fast, he feared there would be no stopping them. "Daddy," his daughter said again, her voice trembling slightly now. "They're coming for me, aren't they?" He didn't know how to answer. His mind was a blur of questions, fears, and uncertainty. But one thing was clear, whatever was coming through that door, they weren't just going to walk away. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The danger was real, and it was closing in fast. And then, just as the father stepped toward the door, ready to face whatever was on the other side, something unexpected happened. A loud crash echoed through the house, followed by the sound of rushing footsteps. The stranger. He had returned. But it was too late. The door flew open with a violent slam, and the stranger was there, but he wasn't alone. A group of men, faces hidden beneath hoods, stepped in behind him, each one carrying an air of cold determination. The father's heart raced as he moved instinctively to shield his daughter, but he had no idea how to protect her from what was coming. The strangers didn't waste time. One of them pushed the father aside with an unexpected force, sending him stumbling back. His daughter let out a small cry, her tiny body trembling with fear. The father's gaze darted to the man in front of him, the stranger who had warned him, who had shown up just in time. But now, as the tension in the room grew, the father saw something that stopped him cold. There was no sense of urgency in the stranger's eyes anymore. He was calm. Too calm. His posture was rigid, as though he was preparing for something that he knew was about to happen. "You didn't think you could keep her hidden forever, did you?" One of the men sneered, his voice harsh, laden with a sense of finality. The father felt the ground beneath him shake as the man's words sunk in. Hidden? What did he mean? The danger had escalated beyond anything he could comprehend. It wasn't just about his daughter anymore. It was about power, control, and something far more dangerous. But the man's eyes, the one who had appeared to warn him, held no fear. There was only a distant, almost knowing look in them. "Step aside," the man ordered, his voice low but unwavering. The father hesitated, not understanding the sudden shift in the situation. Why was this stranger, who had seemed like a hero only moments ago, suddenly allowing this to happen? The figure who had been leading the group of strangers pushed past the father, locking eyes with the daughter. There was a dark intensity in his gaze, a quiet threat that made the air in the room feel suffocating. "It's time," he said softly, as though speaking to someone far older than the girl standing before him. For a split second, everything stopped. The father's heart thundered in his chest. He wanted to act, to grab his daughter and run, but something held him back. He needed to understand what was happening, needed to make sense of the chaos before it consumed them all. Just as the figure reached for his daughter, something strange happened. The little girl, who had been silent this whole time, took a step forward, her small hand reaching toward the man. The father froze, unable to comprehend what was unfolding in front of him. His daughter's eyes were locked on the stranger, but they weren't filled with fear. They were filled with something else: recognition. The stranger stopped in his tracks, his face now pale with shock. He took a step back, his eyes flicking between the girl and the man who had been guiding them. What is this?" She can't," his voice faltered, confusion mixing with fear. The man turned to the group of strangers, his expression one of disbelief. The father's head spun. What was going on? What had just happened? He turned to the man who had brought them here. "What are you not telling me?" But before he could get an answer, the girl spoke, her voice quiet but filled with an undeniable certainty. "I've known you were coming," she said, her words almost too calm for the situation. "I've always known." The room fell silent, every person frozen in place as if caught in a trance. The father looked at his daughter in disbelief. How could she possibly know? This entire time, he had been running, protecting her, trying to shield her from whatever dark force these people represented. But his daughter was different. She wasn't afraid. She was connected to them in a way he couldn't understand. Then, in the blink of an eye, the strangers stepped back, their faces now a mixture of horror and awe. The man who had been leading them lowered his head, muttering something under his breath that no one could hear. The tension in the room remained thick, but for the first time, the father felt a sense of power radiating from his daughter. "Why are you running, then?" the girl asked, her voice cutting through the silence. Her eyes locked on the leader of the group. "If you knew what was coming, why are you so scared?" It was a question that no one had an answer for. The strangers had expected something. They had expected to take her, to control her. But now, standing in the presence of this child, they were all paralyzed by something they couldn't grasp. The father took a step back, the realization dawning on him. His daughter wasn't just a victim in this story. She was the key. She had always been the key. She wasn't just some innocent child caught up in a dangerous game. She was a force to be reckoned with. And the people who had come for her had underestimated her from the beginning. The man who had been the first to warn them looked as though he had seen a ghost. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. And just like that, the illusion shattered. The strangers who had entered their home, confident in their mission, were now looking at the girl with a new kind of fear in their eyes. They knew, perhaps for the first time, that this wasn't just about taking something they wanted. This was about reckoning with something far beyond their understanding. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they turned and fled, leaving the father and daughter standing in the stillness of their home. The father looked at his daughter, his mind reeling from the sudden turn of events. He couldn't understand what had just happened, but he knew one thing: his daughter was no ordinary child. She had powers, abilities that had drawn these people to her. But what did that mean for their future? Before he could speak, the girl turned to him, her expression softening. "It's not over," she said simply. The father looked at her, his breath catching in his throat. The danger wasn't gone. It had only just begun. The father's mind raced, caught between the fear of what was coming and the shock of the girl's words. He looked at her, his protective instincts still on edge. His daughter, the same girl who had once been so innocent, now stood before him with a knowing calmness that unnerved him more than the strangers ever could. The air was thick with tension, as if something unseen was hanging over them, waiting to strike. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to process what had just happened, or what it meant for their future. What was his daughter now? What had she become? He took a step closer to her, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her shoulder. "Are you sure about this? Are you sure we can't just walk away from all of this? I never wanted this for you." The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with an understanding far beyond her years. "You can't walk away from something that's already inside of you," she said softly. "It's part of who I am." His heart dropped. He had hoped, even prayed, that he could shield her from whatever dark path was calling to her. But now, faced with her unwavering certainty, he realized he had no choice but to face it too. A long silence followed. The echoes of the stranger's hasty departure filled the room, but their absence didn't offer the comfort he'd hoped for. The danger was still there, lingering, just out of sight. He knew it wasn't over. They hadn't left because they were done, they had left because something had changed, and they needed time to regroup. As the days passed, the world outside their homes seemed unchanged, but inside, the weight of what they had just experienced settled in like an uninvited guest. The father spent sleepless nights trying to understand the depth of what his daughter was capable of. There were moments when he would catch her staring out the window, a faraway look in her eyes, as if she could see something he couldn't. He decided to confront the man who had once come to warn them, the one who had seemed so determined to help but had revealed only fragments of the truth. It wasn't easy to find him. The man had disappeared, leaving only a trail of rumors behind him. But eventually, through a mix of old contacts and some hard digging, the father found him. They met in a quiet, dimly lit CAF, the kind of place where secrets were kept and promises were made. The man's face was older than the father remembered, wearied by time and the burden of knowledge. "Why didn't you tell me everything?" the father demanded as soon as he sat down. The man took a deep breath, his eyes weary but determined. "Because I didn't think you were ready," he said slowly. "The truth is, your daughter's power is something rare, something that not many people understand. And there are forces out there who would do anything to control it. The father's mind reeled. What do you mean? What exactly is she? She's not just a regular child. She has a gift, a connection to something bigger than any of us, the man explained. Something ancient. And those people, the ones who came for her, they know it. They've been searching for her for years. And now that they know she's here, they won't stop. They'll keep coming. The father's heart sank. But why her? Why my daughter? The man paused, his eyes darting around as if to make sure no one was listening. Because she has the ability to change everything. The world as we know it is built on a fragile balance, and she has the power to tip that balance. To either bring about a new era or destroy everything. The weight of the man's words hit the father like a physical blow. He had known there was something special about his daughter, something that had always set her apart. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. I need to know how to protect her, the father said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression softened, but there was little comfort in it. You can't protect her from everything. Not when it's already inside of her. But you can help her understand it. You can help her control it. The conversation left the father shaken, his mind swirling with thoughts of what was to come. But there was one thing he knew for sure now: his daughter's life would never be the same. Neither would his. Over the next few weeks, things changed. The father spent hours talking to his daughter, trying to understand the depths of her abilities, trying to help her understand them too. She didn't resist, didn't shy away from the truth. She accepted it with a quiet grace, as if it were always meant to be. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the danger grew. The strangers, the ones who had come for her, weren't the only ones searching for her. There were others, darker forces with a far more sinister purpose, who had learned of her existence. They had their own plans for her, plans that didn't involve her well-being. The father realized then that his fight wasn't just about protecting his daughter. It was about making sure she understood what was at stake. She had the power to change the course of history, but only if she was willing to accept it, to embrace it. But with that power came consequences, and the father knew the path ahead was fraught with danger. He knew there would be sacrifices, difficult choices to be made. He had to trust his daughter to make the right decisions, even when the stakes were at their highest. The final confrontation came unexpectedly, in the middle of an ordinary evening. The father had just finished dinner when he heard a soft knock at the door. He opened it to find a familiar face standing in the doorway, a man he hadn't seen in months, but one he recognized immediately. The man's expression was grim. "They've found her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's time." The father felt the blood drain from his face. He looked back at his daughter, who stood behind him, her eyes already filled with a knowing sadness. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. The man stepped inside, and the father closed the door behind him. "What now?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. The man looked at the father and daughter, a flicker of something in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or sympathy. "Now we fight. But this isn't just about survival anymore. It's about what kind of world you want to live in." The tension in the room was palpable as the father took a deep breath, turning to face his daughter. He knew, without a doubt, that this was the moment that would define everything. It wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about standing beside her, trusting her to make the right choices. She nodded at him, her small hand resting in his. And in that moment, the father realized that the fight ahead wasn't just hers. It was theirs. Together. As they prepared to face whatever came next, one thing was clear: the future was uncertain, and the stakes were higher than they could have ever imagined. But no matter what, they would face it as a family, united in the belief that love and strength were the keys to surviving whatever dark forces threatened to tear them apart. The world had changed. But so had they. And now, they would change the world.